right now. Hello, everybody. Everybody mute, please. We're about to begin. My name is Evan Lane. I'm the faculty director of the All-Inspector Center. I'm very pleased to welcome my colleague and good friend, Dr. Raju Parakkal. He's Associate Professor of International Relations, College of Humanities and Sciences at Thomas Jefferson University. And today he's going to present his research on various economic, political, and other factors associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. This is research and a comparative policy analysis concerning COVID-19 that Dr. Parakkal began in the summer, and he is ready to share his very interesting and novel results with us. As faculty director of the All-Inspector Center, we present the research and findings of our faculty at Thomas Jefferson University, and this is part of our series. I thank you for joining us today, and once again, welcome Dr. Parakkal to begin his presentation. It will be about for 45 minutes, after which there will be a Q&A. So I ask you to please mute your mics and turn off your video until then. And at that point, of course, when you have a question, you will then turn them on. I want you to note that this is being recorded and will be on the Facebook site for the Spectre Cast. Questions can be asked verbally then, please not through the chat window. At this point, I'm very proud and happy to turn it over to my, as I said, good friend and colleague, Dr. Parakkal.
Thank you so much, Professor Lane, for that introduction and invitation. I want to thank the Spectre Center for sponsoring this presentation, and also everybody who's joined us and hopefully will join as we proceed with the presentation. So I don't know, have you, I am the co-host. I'm going to share my screen right now. All right. I hope my screen is being shared at this point.
All good.
Okay. All right. So as you see, the title of the paper and that of this presentation is Comparative Analysis of the COVID-19 pandemic, People, Politics, and Policy. So that's the title for the presentation and the title for the paper I'm working on. And I'm an associate professor of international relations at Thomas Jefferson University here in Philadelphia. And I've given my email address, and in case anybody wants to write to me about this research, or there are ways we are trying to see if anybody's interested in the paper, they can get hold of it. And I'll give you more details about the status of my research as we proceed with this presentation. And so as Professor Lane said, this presentation is going to be for about 45 minutes. And after that, there will be a question and answer session. So let me first go ahead and present all my research and the findings, and then we can have a discussion based on your questions and comments and reactions. And once again, thank you all for joining. So here is how I plan to proceed with today's presentation and the outline. I first want to spend maybe a minute on the motivation and background, and it is quite personal in some ways, and I'm pretty sure a lot of you will relate to me on this one. And then I proceed to show you explain the nature of the research, because I have to show that, because I am not a medical researcher. I am not a physician. I'm not in the medical side of Thomas Jefferson University. I am what you call as you might know as a political economist. And so I will explain that. And then we'll take a look at how COVID-19 has spread and the top countries. At this point, most of us are very familiar with those details, but I think it's good to just refresh memory. There's one part that I have it in my paper, but that I'm not going to show in the interest of time, and also because we have a very varied audience. And so I want to keep it more to what's of most interest to most of the people joining in. So like I said, if you're interested in that part, once the paper is ready, you can read about the past relevant comparative political science and economics research on just generally about pandemic, not entirely about COVID-19. Then I proceed to show you the research argument and the framework, and follow it up with the variables and hypotheses. And very importantly, I spent some time showing you about the data and the measures and the estimation techniques, because what you find in research is a lot based on the data and the techniques that you use. So, if you were to use sort of a computer language, it's, garbage in, garbage out. So you have to make sure that everything is done correctly. And finally, we wrap it up with some findings and discussions, and then some conclusions and implications that I have for based on this research. All right, so the next slide, what you're going to see is might be probably quite different from what you've probably seen in research presentations. Like I said, this has a very personal side to it. So back in the spring summer period, as I'm sure a lot of you will relate to me, we were all, at least most of the people on this call, were holed up at home. And for me, these were images that pictures I took, because being a social scientist, I knew that 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, I would look back at this time and then want to see what was I doing at that time. Well, I was watching a lot of CNN. Anderson Cooper was at 8 o'clock in the evening. I'm talking about US Eastern time. And as you can see, Harvard doctor, another 100,000 people in the US will die from coronavirus by September. So this was back early in the summer. And like most of us, I was stocking up on food. I was stocking up on my hand sprays, making a lot of my very favorite chicken wings, and getting back on old stuff like Miami beating up on Florida State, eating a lot of turkey burgers, and seeing my hair grow a lot, because there were no hairdressers available at that time, and watching up on a lot of Springsteen walking through the streets of Philadelphia. By the way, he's just dropped his latest album today. So that's very, very, very good, very auspicious. Anyway, my point in saying all this was that this was a time when they said, you sit on the couch and you can save the world. Well, I was doing that, but at the same time, I was feeling like I need to get more into what I, as someone who's trained in this kind of research, can do. And I checked online for a lot of information based on all the questions that I actually asked in this research. And I found that there has not been much done, probably because it was very new. And so I said, why don't I take a look at this myself? And then I quickly realized that this was going to be quite a huge challenge, but something that I decided, okay, I am so much into this, I better get this done. And that's where it all began. So just my motivation and the background to put it in perspective. All right, now to the more somber, serious stuff. The nature of the research. I am a professor of international relations, but I also do a lot of research in comparative political economy and comparative politics, and also comparative policy analysis. So one word that you see most in that is the word comparative. And what I'm doing in this research is also comparing across countries. And the whole sample is actually, it's not a sample, it's actually the entire world. Although some of those countries drop out as we get closer to the research. It is extremely multidisciplinary. As I told some of my colleagues, I had to read up on so many areas that I had not done so much of reading into. For example, the health and medical systems, some parts of public administration, but definitely it draws a lot from the social sciences, mainly political science, economics, and some parts of not mainstream sociology, but something to do with society and social aspects. It is designed in the form of a quantitative data analysis, like you have hypothesis testing. That's the style of research we're doing here. The status of the research at this point is that it is a working paper. It is not a completed paper. It is a paper at this point. It is a draft. And so if you are interested in getting a copy of the paper when it is done, and I would say give it another month or two, probably by December, because things are going to become quite hectic for most of us here in academia, at least in US academia. So if you're interested, you can drop your email ID in the chat box, and before the call is ended, I will gather all the email IDs, and when the when the paper is in a full draft form, I can email it to you if you're interested. Just a quick recap of the origins of the pandemic. Sometime in December 2019, as we know, the outbreak happened in Wuhan, China, and shortly thereafter, on January 13th, yes, the first case was reported outside China, actually from someone who traveled from Wuhan to Thailand. And that date, March 11th, is very important. On March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 outbreak as a pandemic. But I mean, it's important for two reasons. One, it's important just because that's the day when it was declared as a pandemic, but also that's the day that I use as an important date in the research. And one thing we need to note is that even by March 11th, people had become quite aware that this was really something extremely serious. So you could say that the WHO was maybe a week or 10 days, but you know, they cannot go around just declaring before they have confirmed it themselves. And historically, this was the first pandemic to have originated from a coronavirus. So coronavirus is of different types. When we have COVID-19, we have SARS-CoV-2 as one of the coronaviruses. And on March 11th, the world had 120,927 infections, of which China had 80,980. And remember, it started in China, so China at that time was at the top. And the deaths were 4,294. And again, China was topping it at that time. China is no longer topping it at this point on either of these cases or deaths. Just a quick note, all of this data that I'm presenting is from this website, this marvelous website, I should add, and I'm so thankful to them, Our World in Data, and they have collected their data from so many other sources. This is a website that is maintained by Global Change Data Lab at the University of Oxford in the UK, and they collect their data from so many government sources, so their data is as authentic as it can get. I want to run us through some of the initial phases of this pandemic, and so that we are all on the same page. So I'm sure this figure that you're seeing is from the graph you're seeing is from January 1st to March 11th. So that period just before the WHO declared this as a pandemic. And as you can see, it was quite flat during January, and then by the end of January, it started really peaking up. And then by March 11th, as I said earlier, we had 120,000 cases. This one is the deaths, total deaths across the world. And here you can see by the time March 11th, same thing in January, it was lying low, and then suddenly it started picking up quite a bit. I do change the color for a reason, because it had become a pandemic at that time. So this is the period March 11th to August 31st. So that's the end period of my study, August 31st, because I had to stop somewhere. And I got the sense from reading all the articles and press releases that August 31st end of August was a good time, because the first phase in so many ways was sort of ending. This is not a research that can really end. You can keep on doing it, but I had to stop at some point. So August 31st, so all the data is as of August 31st or as of ending August 31st of this year. And as you can see, the cases just kept, it was quite a secular increase in the total cases. A little over 25 million. And then the total deaths in the world are also going up. I mean, that line is quite telling. as to how many people have lost their lives to this during this period that ever since the WHO declared it as a pandemic. I do want to focus on countries at this point. So what I showed earlier was about the world. So here are the top 5 countries plus China. This is the total number of cases. This is between the period March 11 to August 31st. So the US has really taken off in the number of cases. This does not take into account the population size. So this is the US, this is the just the total cases. And one country I want you to look at is actually India here, because if you look at the color, the line for India, it is lying quite flat. And then by around July, which is the time when India relaxed its lockdown, you can see that that India is really going up. And I believe at this point India is number 2 in number of cases below the United States. This actually takes into account the population size, because as we all know, the more people there are, the more cases potentially. Here you have a totally different set of 5 top countries. You have Qatar, you have Bahrain, you have Chile, you have Panama, and you have Kuwait as the top 5 countries. So this takes into account the population size of the countries. I'm also looking at the deaths. So you can see the total deaths of the top 5 countries. Again, this is just deaths without taking into consideration the population size. And here also, the US is topping in the world. Brazil is also topping. Mind you, this is at the end of August 31st, the end period. So we are a few more months beyond that at this point. So this is, and I don't think this has changed much in that sense between then and now. Maybe India and Brazil have just traded spots of second and third. So then, this slide takes into account the population size, and here you find a bit of a difference. There are more than a couple of European countries coming into play here: Belgium, Spain, and UK, and there is Peru and Chile. So this takes into account the population size of countries. This is when it comes to total deaths. This is per million population. All right, so I just wanted to lay some ground here in terms of where the countries are, who are the countries we're talking about here. And my research arguments is that the SARS-CoV-2 virus, so COVID-19 is the disease and SARS-CoV-2 is the virus. SARS-CoV-2 virus does not distinguish between countries when it comes to how it affects people in its potency and lethality. And so that part there is no distinguishing between that. The virus doesn't distinguish between whether you're an American or an Indian or Spanish or Nigerian. However, my argument is that the effects of the deadly effects of the virus are sort of moderated by a bunch of factors that you can find that are specific to each country. And that arrow sign means leads to. So this leads to variations in the numbers of infected cases and deaths. So this is the argument I'm making, that the way in which countries are organized, how they do their policy, and a bunch of other country level factors do make a difference in how many people are infected and how many people die from this virus. So for example, people often have said that countries like New Zealand, which shut down their borders much more vehemently than a few other countries, India also did the same thing, have at least during that period have found that the number of cases and deaths have gone down. Now we can revisit that argument towards the end of this presentation when you see the numbers, but that is kind of the argument I'm making, that countries can take measures to make sure that the cases and deaths stay low. Now there is a theoretical framework for this sort of an argument from my main field, which is international relations. It's actually a framework I used in my doctoral dissertation 15 years ago. It is known as the second image reversed. What it does is it looks at the effects of it argues that the effects of international factors, for example, in this case, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the effects of international factors on domestic outcomes. And in this case, the domestic outcome is the number of infected cases and deaths, are mediated through country level factors and structures. So mediated, in some cases, the argument is that it's moderated. So I'm making the argument that it's moderated, not necessarily mediated, but they're moderated through by a host of country level factors and structures. And I finally rounded up the argument that saying that therefore country level factors, which I call in this research as country profiles. So please keep that expression in mind. Country profiles are theoretically associated with the incidence of COVID-19 cases and deaths. So that is my overarching argument. And let's see how what we find on that argument. So here is the research framework. I'm interested in COVID-19 cases and COVID-19 deaths. And there are two ways that the medical field measures deaths in this situation. It's deaths per capita, which is known as the infection. WHO calls it infection fatality ratio, IFR. And there is the COVID-19 deaths per case, which is the case fatality ratio, which is CFR. And of course, I'm interested in COVID-19 cases, that is total cases per million population. And I would like to sort of make a case that when it comes to these country level factors, the further we go from cases towards deaths, it's going to be probably a lot more difficult to establish a strong causal connection, because there are so many factors that happen between then and finally at death. I do control for those factors, but I do want to make that information out there. So in another way, what I'm saying is my primary interest is mostly in cases and not so much deaths, because of this extra leap that you have to go from cases to death. I do control for it, but you'll see. The country profile. There are 6 profiles that I'm interested in. The economic profile as measured by income inequality, GDP, which is the national income of a country, and GDP per capita, that is the income of a person in a country. The political profile, the political system. Look at whether it's a democracy and whether it's a authoritarian regime. I also look at the ideology of government. I want to look at whether the political ideology of a government, whether it's a left-oriented, it's a center government, or it's a right-leaning government, at the time of the outbreak of the pandemic, 2020, I'm sorry, does it make a difference? So that's those are the two variables that make up the political profile. When it comes to social profile, this was an index that I created based on some surveys done previously. And here, what I'm looking at is societal quality index. I'll explain it later as part of the presentation. The policy profile, the variable I'm looking at is how stringent was the lockdown. So this is also sort of an index. The last two, the leader profile. I'm also interested in the educational background of the executive leader, and there are reasons why that matters in such situations, and we will get to that as I show you my hypotheses. And the health system, the healthcare model. So this one is probably more straightforward to understand. That does the specific nature of the healthcare model affect anything to do with have anything to do with the incidence of COVID-19 cases and deaths? All of these are explained in the upcoming slides. However, I'm also quite aware that those are not the only factors that affect cases and deaths when it comes to COVID-19. One of the control variables that I use, a very important one, is tests per capita. And as our president said, President Trump, that if you test, that's when the numbers go up. And it's true. So if you don't test, you don't go up, at least in terms of the statistics. So I do have to control for the tests per capita, and that is a variable that is always there in all the models, except the last one, and I'll tell you why it's not there. It's replaced by a proxy variable. And then there are the COVID-19 deaths. Same thing, you have to control for the positivity rate. So the positivity rate is the share of COVID-19 tests that are positive. So if it's not positive, then that means your chances of death are much lower. So I do use that as a control variable. Finally, there are these control variables that are used in both when I'm trying to analyze cases and when I'm trying to do the estimation for deaths. The median age, because the older the population of a country is, the higher you can expect their cases and deaths. The same thing with urban agglomeration. It is kind of like it's measuring the density of people and activity inside in the urban areas of population. So if it's a place that is much more densely populated, a country with so much of urban density, you can expect the cases and deaths to be much higher. Also, I'm looking at the health expenditure, the amount of money spent on healthcare per person by a country. And finally, the GDP and GDP per capita come back in the models, because income is a huge factor for pretty much everything that we're trying to analyze as a social scientist. So these two variables, they are of interest in and of themselves, but they're also coming back as control variables. I do have to give you some motivation as to why these variables are actually allowed to be used for research like this. So past research, not just on COVID-19, not on COVID-19, it's a new phenomenon, but past research has found out that higher levels of income inequality adversely affect health and medical outcomes like mortality rates, and that a person's individual's health status is better in societies with a more equal distribution of income. So income inequality is a factor theoretically that I'm looking at here. And I expect that the sign, that means it will be a positively related to, again, this is my expectation. We have to do the analysis to find out whether it's true. So this is the expectation that income inequality, higher income inequality would be associated with more cases of COVID-19 cases and deaths. When it comes to the gross domestic product, GDP and GDP per capita, my expectation is of a negative relationship. That means because wealthier countries and wealthier people have more resources to combat diseases and pandemics. And so given that argument, you can expect that wealthier countries would have fewer cases and deaths from COVID-19. Again, these are expectations. These are not the facts. I don't want anybody to misunderstand that I am making that claim. I'm only saying that this is what we can expect. And that is the reason why these variables are in this research to begin with. The political system is measured from in an increasing degree of democracy. Here, interestingly, the expectation is that the greater political freedoms given by democracies to their citizens would actually make it so much more difficult to tell them to stay home and stay on the sofa and to be the couch warrior, because people are so used to a lot more political freedoms in democracies versus authoritarian regimes. So you can expect higher numbers when it comes to democracies. And when it comes to the political ideology, that means the ideology of the government, it's measured from left to right. And typically, and again, this is typically right-leaning governments favor favor the economy and businesses over social/health concerns. And so, again, this is typical. I'm not saying that every single right-leaning government does that, but this is what we would expect. And let's see if it plays out in our data. The social quality index, a societal sense of shared responsibility, is so important. You know, we've all been so aware of this expression of we are all in this together, and that the United Nations sent out. And so I'm trying to look at how a social sense of shared responsibility affects or has any effects on COVID-19 cases and deaths. So the next one is the lockdown stringency. The expected sign is negative. That means if you had a very stringent lockdown, then you can expect lower COVID-19 cases and deaths. Again, these are expectations. We don't know if for true. We'll see in a few minutes. The educational background. So here I have to give some explanations, because research has found out that when it comes to situations of crises, political leadership is extremely critical in how you manage it. And some early research on this particular aspect. So there are two authors from the UK, Garikapati and Kambhampati, who looked at the gender of the head of the government. And they, using their techniques, they found out that women leaders have been much more successful in actually handling and combating and keeping the numbers low. My interest is more in the educational background for the reason, because under tremendous pressure, when leaders want to bring things back to normal, the one thing that they reach for are their core values and the proven methods that they are used to, and they feel that that is going to be the anchor for them to become successful in handling this crisis. And the argument I make is that the educational background of a political leader forms those sets of core values and familiar methods, and that influences their motivations and actions. So that's how the educational background of an executive leader, and it's measured from non-business towards business. So the expected sign is again positive, because I feel that the more pro-business, the more pro-economy, there might be more of an emphasis on the economy sort of versus health and social concerns to come up first. And the last one, and which I'm guessing, as a professor at Thomas Jefferson University, we have a lot of hospitals, the national healthcare model. So this goes from centralized to decentralized systems. And here, I don't have a firm negative or positive. It could be negative or positive at the expected sign. We don't know. So if you don't know, I'm just going to give you a sort of a quick overview. All countries in this world have one of four healthcare systems: the Beveridge model, the Bismarck model, the national health insurance model, and the out-of-pocket or hybrid model in some cases. So the negative hypothesis comes from the fact that many of the systems that are centralized might be better able to coordinate their response and avoid any kind of collective action problems when it comes to handling this crisis, or any crisis for that matter. The positive hypothesis, which means that the more decentralized it is, the more you could have COVID cases and deaths, is on the fact that a major advantage of, sorry, I should have flipped that. I think it should be the positive and the negative. So essentially what happens is, with decentralized systems, what will happen is there is a better access to good quality information. At least that's the argument. And so decentralized systems can keep the numbers down. So yeah, that is a typo, and my apologies. It should be the negative hypothesis at the bottom and the positive hypothesis at the top. But you get the idea that the argument is that it could happen to be higher or lower in either of these two cases. A little more example details on these two models, on these four models, sorry, is the Beveridge model is the centralized model. It's what we typically know as the socialized medicine, the National Health Service. And here the government provides healthcare, which are funded by taxes. And I'll give you some examples. This is not an exhaustive list of examples. There's just a few examples. The UK comes up first because the Beveridge model actually was started in the UK. And there are some Scandinavian countries, Spain, Italy, New Zealand, the list goes on. Then there's the Bismarck model. And from that name, you can figure out that this was started in Germany, and it was. And this is a lot more decentralized, not as decentralized as the out-of-pocket or hybrid model, but it's also considered as the medical literature considers this a decentralized model. And this is largely followed in Germany, Austria, Japan. The list is also more in that list. And here what happens is there are private players, but there's no profit motive, but the health insurance is financed by both employers and employees through payroll deduction. The national health insurance is also a decentralized one. It's actually a mix of both the Beveridge and Bismarck models. The providers are private, but they are paid by a government-run insurance program into which all citizens have to pay. So there are not many countries that follow this. Canada is the primary example, and then there's Taiwan, and there is South Korea. And the final model in this healthcare model is the most decentralized. This is the pay out of pocket plus some elements of the previous three models. That's why it's called the hybrid model. And this is where a lot of the countries come, developing and less developed countries, and the United States. So the US is quite an outlier being in this particular group because the first three models are very expensive to maintain. So mostly you find economically developed countries in the first three, but the US is not there. The US is actually quite a hybrid / out-of-pocket model. Here I'm giving you, for those of you who are interested, how did I get all this data? Where is it, and how did I manage? So here is a quick rundown of the data that we are using. So all COVID-19 cases and deaths come from, as I said earlier, Our World in Data, and these are total confirmed COVID-19 cases and deaths as of August 31st, 2020. The income inequality is the Gini index. It goes from 0 to 100%. It's from the World Bank. So are the GDP and GDP per capita. They're from the World Bank. The political system, I have used two as a robustness check. The main one I use is the Polity4 database from 2018. I also confirm that these are still valid. So in many cases, we have to go with the latest data available. The ideology of the government is a 3-point scale. 1 means left, 2 means center, 3 means right. And the data is available as of 2017, but I also made sure that all the countries in the data are countries that had no change in their government between the time when this database was released and early 2020. The society is a scale variable it's a standardized scale variable with a convex alpha of 0.66. So anybody who's aware of this knows that if a convex alpha, which is like the inter-rater reliability of all the constituent survey instruments that goes into a particular variable, if it is approaching 0.70, it's actually a pretty good thing to use. So mine is approaching 0.70, it's 0.66. So this is based on 6 survey modules from the World Value Survey, the latest, the latest but one wave. Sense of community, belief. So how much does a country, the people there have a sense of community? How much do they believe in science, which is very important when it comes to combating COVID-19? How much trust do they have in each other, societal trust? And if you're somebody who's living in the United States, you know what I'm talking about. Confidence in the media. How much do we think that the media is not giving us fake news? And in this day and age, that is very important. And basically, how much do we have confidence in government institutions? So when the chief scientist goes on TV or radio and tells us, do this, do that, how much do we trust? So that is what the societal quality index looks at. The lockdown stringency. This is looking at, it's a composite measure. I did not create this. This was already made by the world, Our World in Data, bless their hearts. This includes 9 response indicators like school closures, workplace closures, travel bans, and it is on a scale from 0 to 100. 100 is the strictest response. So higher this number, we expect that the lower would be the COVID, against expectations. We don't know for sure. The last 2 variables and the way they are measured, this one took up a lot of my personal attention, the educational background of the executive leader. That is also a 3-point scale based on how much they are pro. I'm not saying that being pro science is necessarily anti business or vice versa. What I'm saying is that at least in this COVID-19 arguments, what we have found is that there is some level of urgency, some level of um, uh, mutual differentiation between the two, that people are at least employing in their arguments, that if you're more pro-business, more pro-economy, then you might be less of caring about the social and health aspects. So here is how I categorized it. And this was hand collected. I actually did it for all of this. And it took me many months, actually, uh, from various government sources, news media. So if you're a scientist, if you're a physician, I didn't find too many engineers, but if you're a physician, with a leader with like if you went to medical school before you became the executive leader of your country, I put it under the point of one. Lawyers, military background, journalism, all of those come, or mixed background, mixed education come under two. And number three is business. So people who had a business background, for example, President Trump, who went to University of Pennsylvania Business School, he would be coming under number three, whereas the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, would be under one. She's a scientist. So that's a good example of two individuals who are so different in their approach to this particular pandemic. And finally, healthcare model. It's also a 3-point scale variable. One is a centralized model, Beveridge model. Two is the slightly decentralized models, the Bismarck and the National Health Insurance. And three is the most decentralized. It includes the countries that are not classified in the other two, the three models, and includes the mix or hybrid of health systems. That's how I've classified. And the source for the data is, again, multiple. As you can see, data source from various sources I have found. So this is how I have, this is the information for the data. Very quickly, I have to give you the information for where the data came from when it comes to all the control variables. Most of it is either from our World in Data or from the World Bank. I can answer any questions in the Q&A when we get to that. A quick look at the descriptive statistics. So these are not the results. These are just a description of all the data you saw here. So as you can see, if you see the observations, total cases, 209. That means the original database had 209, as they call it, the locations. I don't really have 209. The numbers really drop. And here is very important. If you look at those numbers for the societal quality, it drops down to 53. That means I only have data for 53 countries. So the observations have implications for how you find the results. And it's also very important for us to look at the descriptive statistics for the control variables, because as I said, the tests per capita are an integral part of this analysis. And I only have data for 70 countries. So even though the total data is for 209 countries, as people who do this kind of quantitative research know, you are sort of at the mercy of the variable that has the least number of observations. So I'm at the mercy of tests per capita and the positivity rate, because the observations are very low. One important aspect before I show you the results is how the data is distributed, because the distribution of the data dictates what type of estimation or statistical technique that I use when it comes to evaluating the data that I have. Not to take too much time, but I do have to run you through this data distribution. Some of my friends on this call who might be aware, this data is not normally distributed. And I did check this not just visually as we are doing right now, but I also did check it with actual estimation, and I found that none of this data is normally distributed, which is a very important factor. It's not a hugely critical factor, but it's important. So I'm just showing you the distributions, the frequency distributions of all the variables that I just described. And if you look at the lower right corner, the healthcare model, you will find that, as I said earlier, most countries fall under the hybrid / out of pocket. All right, this one is standing by itself because that's the end of it. And one more slide before I show you the results. The data are not normally distributed. I just showed you that, and it's actually a fact from my analysis. So I have to use non-parametric techniques, and the non-parametric technique that I used is what is known as a bootstrap technique. It is a resampling technique. Basically, it uses the existing sample, and it just draws 1,000 replications of that sample. So one great advantage of the non-parametric bootstrap technique is that it doesn't have any assumptions that the data is normally distributed. So it is the appropriate thing to technique to use in this case, and the results I find are valid. So these are important from a data analysis perspective. Here's the first set of results. I know this is the key thing. Income inequality. So this is the economic variables. I have actually I have like 25 pages of results, but I'm just going to show you 6 very quickly. So as you can see, income inequality, as expected, has a positive relationship with both with cases and also with the IFR. So model 1 and models 1 and 2 are the cases. Models 3 and 4 are the IFR, the infection fatality ratio. Models 5 and 6 are the case fatality ratio. But one of the things I want to say is that since there are say that not all of these results are statistically significant, and if it's not statistically significant, to a large extent, we don't give too much importance to that finding. And if you see a star, so for example, under model 1, if you look next to income inequality, it says 358.84, and you see 3 stars. If you see anything if you see a star, it means it is statistically significant. And if you see 2 or 3, it means it is really, really statistically significant. And let's interpret just one. What that 358 is saying is that as with each 1% increase in the level of income inequality, you can expect 358 cases per million population. That's what it's saying. The same thing is being said in 430 with the 431. The only issue that I was finding was that the reason, if you're wondering why did I estimate 2 models for cases, is that there is something, again, this is a statistical thing, there's some kind of a collinearity between healthcare expenditure per capita and the GDP per capita. So if you notice in model 1, there's GDP per capita included, but in model 2, it is not, because that's where I include the health expenditure per capita. When it comes to the infection fatality ratio, it's still statistically significant, but it's not significant when it comes to the case fatality ratio. And both the GDP and, in one case, GDP per capita is statistically significant, but they all take the income inequality takes the expected sign. It's all positive. That means the original hypothesis has a lot of confirmation in these results. GDP, not so much, but again, they are not statistically significant, so I'm not making much of an explanation. And the remaining variables, the test per capita, the positivity rate, median age, they're all control variables. So they're just there to make sure that the results you find for the initial variables of interest are actually something that we can consider as valid. So this is the economic profile. Let's get to the political profile, and I will have to disappoint my political science friends here. None of these the variables are there's no statistical significance. So, and the results are sort of all over the place. So it's another way of saying that the political system or the ideology of the government did not really make much of a, it's inconclusive. We cannot say one way or the other about how they are related to COVID-19 cases and deaths. So because, there is no statistical significance. And if you're wondering, I'm showing you only the full models. I also did what we call as baseline models and augmented models. It's very similar. The results don't change. The political profile is not a significant aspect when it comes to COVID-19 cases and deaths. However, when it comes to the social quality index and cases, we do find a very strong, not just statistically significant, but also substantively. So if you remember, this is a scale variable and a standardized scale variable. So every notch you go, so that means every notch of improvement on the societal quality index was witnessed to 5,752 cases per million population lower. That's what that negative sign says. That means there are payoffs, good payoffs, positive payoffs to a society that is much more believing in science, trusting each other, trusting the government, and trusting the news sources, the mainstream news sources. The findings for the social quality index when it comes to deaths, not statistically significant, so I don't want to make a claim on that, but I do want to make a claim about the connection between the social quality index and the number of cases. For example, when they say wear a mask, trust each other, and you can see lower cases. The lockdown stringency, I took the date of March 11th because that's when WHO declared this as a pandemic. So my analysis was, okay, did the initial lockdown make a difference to the total number of cases and deaths by the time we reached August 31st, August 31st. The sign is negative for both cases and IFR, which means that it is in that direction. However, none of this is statistically significant. And I will explain this later when we have the discussion, why I think it is not statistically significant. The leader's educational background is significant all through, meaning the more a leader is away from science and more to, again, I'm not saying that business people are anti-science. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm just saying in this particular context, that is kind of the reaction that we have seen among many leaders. So this is sort of what we are finding, that if you are more pro-business and more pro-economy and largely away from from science physician level, we're finding that there are more cases and more deaths happening from COVID-19. From COVID-19. This is the healthcare model. And I know many of my colleagues at Thomas Jefferson would be quite interested in knowing this. There is nothing conclusive that we can say about IFR and CFR. So that the two deaths variables, but there is something conclusive we can say about the cases, that as we move more from the centralized to the decentralized, you do find that the cases are substantively going up in those countries. And there is a tremendous level of statistical significance to that finding. And finally, I put them all together, but here is a problem. I don't have too many observations. I mean, I'm doing the bootstrap non-parametric technique, but essentially it is sampling from a smaller base. So for example, if you look down under observations, we are down to 58 or 60 when it comes to this particular variable. And when it comes to a full model, which includes all of these, I do have to eliminate a few. For example, a few variables like the ideology of government, social, and I have to replace the tests per capita with GDP per capita as a proxy variable, all because I need to be cognizant of the sample size that I'm doing the research. So these three models, one is for cases, one is for IFR, one is for CFR. They include all of them in one go. So income inequality, political system, education of the leader, and healthcare model. So as you can see, you do find that the inequality still is significant, and all the values are still in that direction. And the healthcare model is still extremely significant when it comes to the cases. The deaths, if you notice down at the bottom, the observations, when it comes to the two models, IFR and CFR, they're 42 and 42, which means I only have 42 countries in that particular analysis, whereas in the observations, I have 68. Now, I know we are doing 1,000 replications with the bootstrap technique. Still, it is still based on those few cases. And the problem is, the more you have variables, and so in this model, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So when you have 9 to 10 variables and you're working with 40, I would not take this too seriously. You cannot conclude on this. But I can conclude on the cases one because there is more of observations there. My last two slides, the research findings to wrap the whole thing up. Income inequality is positively correlated with COVID-19 cases in IFR. The nature of the political system and the ideology of the ruling government have no systematic impact on COVID-19 cases or deaths. Societal quality significantly reduces COVID-19 cases, but it does not seem to affect COVID-19 deaths, probably because there are so many factors that, it's like what we call in as a technique is we need to do some process tracing to figure out how the process is moving forward from cases to deaths when it comes to societal quality. The lockdown measures do not appear to have any statistical significance, although the signs are in the hypothesized direction. The educational background of the executive leader has a statistically significant impact on COVID cases and deaths. That means the more the background favors business/economy over health as social factors, the higher could be the number of COVID-19 cases and deaths. Countries with more decentralized healthcare models have experienced higher COVID-19 cases. But I don't want to make a conclusion regarding the COVID-19 deaths because there was no statistical significance from that analysis. What are the conclusions? The income inequality findings are consistent with past research. And here is a very interesting thing that all of us, especially folks living in economically advanced countries, I know we have people from many countries on this call, unequal societies, whether the society is rich or not, just unequal societies do not yield positive health or medical outcomes. Because even if you're wealthy, I mean, the US is a perfect example of that. It's a wealthy country, but it's an extremely unequal country compared to other similarly wealthy countries. Just the fact that you don't feel that you are equal to others can actually have very negative health and medical outcomes. So it's not just the poverty, but it's also the feeling of being unequal, and the fact of being unequal. Societal quality, there needs to be more national and local emphasis on improving societal quality. Like, I can't believe I'm saying this in 2020, that we need to have more belief in science, but that's the sad fact. We need to have more social trust. Now, here is an interesting one. Although it was not statistically significant and we saw that the sign was in the hypothesized negative direction, it is still not statistically significant. I think, and this is my explanation for this, that just shutting down a country does not help if you have no planning before or during the lockdown. And I remember having the conversations with regard to India, when India shut down just overnight for 3 to 4 weeks. And my question to my colleagues, both Indian and non-Indian, my questions and my comments was that, okay, you're shut down. What is the plan when the country reopens? What is the plan? If you have no plan, then you're just delaying the inevitable. And that's exactly what happened with India. The leader's education, apologies to my business school colleagues, but well, I don't want to read it out, but you can read it out. When it comes to times of health crisis and pandemics, well, I know it's a little controversial conclusion that I'm making, but it is what it is. Healthcare models. The coordination advantages of centralized systems appear to outweigh the informational advantages of decentralized systems. So if you remember, the decentralized system has an advantage of being more, collecting more information at the very local levels. But it seems like when it comes to situations like this, the centralized systems might have a better coordination advantage. And for developing and less developed countries, the centralized models are still a luxury, but I think something that you should aspire to. And the out-of-pocket hybrid models breed confusion and uncertainty during times of pandemic, because people really don't know. If you have to make 15 phone calls to figure out what you should do, then it's going to be difficult. Thank you. If you have any, we are staying back for some Q&A, but for any reason you need to email me. I've reproduced my email ID here. And if you want a copy of the paper when it's finally done, it might take me a month or two to be fully done with the paper. It is sort of more than halfway, of course, in terms of writing it up. Just put your email ID in the chat box and we will collect it before it's all over. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and then I will take your questions. We have time, 15, 20 minutes, if you have time to stay back and ask questions and have a Q&A. So yeah, thank you again for tuning in and for the presentation.
Well,
you can just unmute yourself. I think you have to unmute and then ask a question.
Well, while people are thinking about it, I'd like to add, I'm not surprised that income equality affects as strongly as you have found. And I was just wondering, what exactly in income equality do you think leads to this situation?
So that has to go into the context. In so many countries that are not wealthy, it would be a factor of the poverty that comes with the income inequality. In wealthy countries, it could be a mix of that and also, like I said earlier, just being unequal in terms of access to healthcare. Because it's a, yeah.
We have a question from, let me read it to you off the chat. It says, thanks for sharing your research. My main question is about the healthcare system variable. I'm wondering, since the N is so small in the category 1 and 2, whether that's really a good measure, even with the bootstrap. What other variables may be better? Could you look at government expenditure on primary health?
No, that is and that is my friend and former colleague, Professor Moladina. Thank you for that question. And that is something that I was really concerned about, and I really wanted to show it during this presentation of how skewed the data was. And and I can look at definitely, and I think I have the data for that. Look at government expenditure on primary health as one of the variables to see if it connects with, yes, definitely. And thank you for the suggestion. And just so you know, I wanted to add that there were so many other variables as part of this research I did. For example, based on the arguments I saw, mostly anecdotal, but arguments I saw in the popular press. For example, a lot of the argument was that being an island nation, so New Zealand was an example of that. Being an island nation provided a sense of security, and not just a sense, an actual security from the virus. I can tell you, although I didn't show it, it doesn't make a difference because we're not living in the 1700s where people travel by. We are living in in modern times where it is people travel differently. So yeah, it might have had some helpful effects in some ways. It wasn't that helpful. But going back to Amias's question, yes, I will look at that variable, and you have to give me. I hope there is a way to copy all of the information from the chat window.
Another question a number of people are asking is, has this been recorded and will they have access to that? And the answer is yes, it has been recorded, and it will be posted on the Spectre Center YouTube site. But of course, you can contact Professor Parakkal and he can be able to send you the link.
Yeah, and before we close, I mean, I'm still staying here in case people are just thinking through the results and you have questions. I'm still available here. We are still available here. But my request to Professor Lane is I still have to figure out a way to copy all the emails from the chat window. If you know how to do it, please do it for me.
This is Barb. Is there a way of presenting the data, or have you thought about it in terms of which countries have achieved the greatest success in limiting cases and deaths, and then matching up the various systems or variables that you use in terms of the most successful have this.
Yeah.
So doing it by country.
Yeah.
Just to explain the results in the country rather than separating them.
Yeah.
Is that a useful way to think about it? Or?
Yeah. So that is all in the paper.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you, Barb. So that's all in the paper. And when we get to the paper, it'll all be in the paper. I mean, like I said, a lot of the things that I have in the paper, I could not bring in because I had to keep the presentation a little short, and even then, I think I went over my allotted time. Yeah, so thank you, Barb, for that. I do agree that it has to have certain countries. So in the discussion section of the paper, I do produce those information down at the, like, for example, the top 5 or top 10 countries that line up on this and this, as you said. Yes. Thank you.
Hey, Raju, this is Tom.
Yeah, Tom, please go ahead.
Hi, can you?
Yeah,
so this is great. This is really fascinating. The question I had was about the social solidarity measure, the social equality measure.
Yeah.
I'm guessing the United States scores pretty low on that variable. I was just wondering which countries score well on it. I'm just curious, where can I go to find a place where people trust each other and pull together on things?
If you give me a second, I can actually, I'm actually running my, using my statistical software to answer your question. Give me just one.
Thank you.
Give me just 1 second. So the All right, so the highest was, give me one second. You have to bear with me, but that's an important question. Not for you to travel away. I don't want to leave.
All right, I probably can't go anyhow. They probably won't let me in because I'm from the US.
Yeah, that's right. Especially now, they're just not going to let you in. That's for sure.
I was just wondering if it's a particular part of the world or a particular
Yeah,
kind of
no,
culture.
the US was on the negative territory, on the negative side of it. That's something I can give you. The top countries were surprisingly Uzbekistan.
That is surprising.
Yeah, but again, we are talking about many factors, 6 factors. So it's not just about one. It's about social cohesion, trusting each other, the neighbors, and all that kind of stuff. So these are probably more collective societies than more individualistic, like the United States, for example. I have more to satisfy your curiosity in terms of the better countries. Malaysia, Rwanda. Japan is also in very positive territory on that scale. The US has good company with Haiti and Algeria. So you have your pick there, Tom, if you want to move to.
Okay, thanks for doing my travel agent work for me. But it's interesting. It sounds kind of random. It's not a particular part of the world or particular culture.
Yeah, you're right. And in fact, that was very surprising for me because, and I'm glad that it surprised me because I didn't want to buy into those stereotypes. Because there are these stereotypes about if you're from certain parts of the world, you will be more this way or that way. No, not really. And I really enjoyed doing this research as sort of in some ways laborious it was, extremely data driven. Like I said, I have 25 pages of results tables. I only showed you what 5 or 6, yeah, and Sweden is in the positive territory, so you might consider Sweden, Tom.
All right, very good. Thanks for looking that up. That's great.
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
Okay,
one more question. We have
Yeah.
one more question. I guess we'll wrap it up. Were you surprised to find that the lockdown stringency did not have a statistically significant effect on 19 cases and deaths?
Not entirely, to be honest with you. It actually came out exactly as I thought, because I did expect it to be negative, that it might have some sort of dampening effect on the number of cases. However, as I said earlier, I have closely followed what was happening in major countries in this crisis, like India, like the United States, like Brazil, where despite any kind of lockdown, people weren't actually following through on what they should be doing, nor the government was following through on what they should be doing in terms of getting the countries ready to be safe when the lockdown ended. So I was not that surprised to find that it was not statistically significant, although it is actually in that direction that it is going. So the other way of concluding that would be that it's not that the lockdown was not a bad idea. It is just that it should have been executed in a little more effective fashion. When I say effective, it is very complicated, because what I don't mean is that it should have been even more stringent. What I mean is that it should have been done in a way where people did not entirely feel that their means of livelihood, their important things they have to do, would be completely destroyed and dismantled. Because that is when people take this desperate choice. Okay, do I go hungry without a job, or do I take the risk of going out and getting infected and infecting other people? And desperate people take desperate measures. And so if the lockdown was done properly, I believe that we could have really found a statistically significant lower numbers on COVID-19 cases and deaths. That's my take on it, and that's something I am expressing in the paper. But thank you so much, Liam, for asking that question.
Okay. At this point, I'd like to point out again that this will be available on the Spectre Center Facebook page. And of course, you can get that from Raju Parakkal, which is raju.parakkal@jefferson.edu. I want to thank really a very large group from all over the world, from Japan to India to the United States. That's what I know of. There could have been a lot more for coming today. And I urge you to listen to all our Spectre cast.
Professor Lane, wouldn't it be available on the YouTube channel also for Spectre
Yes.
Center?
Yes, it'll be on the YouTube as well. So we'll have, and they could contact you, of course, to get the exact location, of course, get the link. So
Yeah, and
thank
before-
you very much, Professor Parakkal, for presenting some very important statistics.
Yeah,
research.
and please don't end the meeting because I want to take down these email IDs. For some reason, I cannot copy.
I
can
did.
only, you
I
did? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, then
Well done.
that's great. There are some more email IDs being provided that they want the paper, and I will make it. I don't know. Okay.
I got it, and I sent it to you in email. All right, thank you very much, Professor Parakkal. I'm going to stop recording right now.